With the bonfire lit, the story begins. The Curse of Zugarramurdi, the Call of the 13 Witches. Spain. Amid the mountains of the Basque Country, the small village of Zugarramurdi holds secrets buried for centuries. During the Spanish Inquisition, dozens of women were accused of witchcraft and burned alive. But before his death, a dark pact was sealed, and now, in the present, something awakens in the forest. When Daniel Carter, an American journalist obsessed with historical mysteries, travels to Zugarramurdi to investigate the ancient trials, he discovers that the legends are more real than he ever imagined. Residents disappear, shadows move among the trees, and strange whispers echo in the caves. What begins as an investigation turns into a nightmare, where the line between reality and superstition blurs. Now, Daniel must fight to escape the fate the witches set centuries ago, before he becomes the next victim of Zugarramurdi's curse. The wind cut through the winding road that led to the small village of Zugarramurdi, hidden among the green hills of the Basque Country. Daniel Carter adjusted his glasses as he steered the rental car around the sharp curves, feeling a strange oppression in the air. There was something different about that place. I didn't know if it was the unsettling silence or the way the trees leaned over the road, as if whispering forgotten secrets. As an investigative journalist specializing in paranormal phenomena, Daniel had spent years chasing stories around the world, but nothing or intrigue as much as Zugarramurdi and his famous witchcraft trials of 1610. What began as simple historical research turned into an obsession when he found documents lost in the archives of the National Library of Spain. One of them mentioned a secret never revealed, something that the Spanish inquisitors hid before burning the 13 women accused of witchcraft. When he finally arrived at the village, Daniel felt as if had crossed an invisible border. The streets were made of uneven stone, and the old houses with dark wood and sloping roofs looked like preserved in another century. The place was small, with a central square where a few people walked around, but there was something wrong. Everyone he saw seemed to avoid him, looking away and muttering among themselves. He stopped the car and entered the only tavern in the village, Taverna de Olenzaro. The smell of wine and burning wood hung in the air, but the place was silent. Very silent. A handful of customers occupied the weathered wooden tables, but as soon as Daniel entered, conversation stopped. He approached the counter. The tavern keeper, a robust man with hard features, was cleaning a glass cup with slow movements. When Daniel opened his mouth to ask for information, the man interrupted him before he said anything. "You shouldn't be here." The innkeeper's voice was low, but carried a warning tone. Daniel raised an eyebrow. It was always like this. Every time he investigated a dark legend, the locals tried to chase him away. But he wasn't the type to be intimidated. "I'm just passing through," he replied casually. "I'm a journalist and I'm writing an article about the witchcraft trials here." The silence in the tavern grew even thicker. One of the customers coughed nervously. A woman made the sign of the cross. The innkeeper narrowed his eyes at Daniel, as if assessing how far he would go. "If you came after ghosts, leave before they find you first." A shiver ran down Daniel's spine. The man's tone was not a threat, but a warning. It was then that the tavern door opened violently. A gust of cold wind invaded the room, extinguishing part of the candles that lit the place. At the entrance, a woman with completely black eyes watched him in silence. The wind howled outside, rattling the tavern's windows. The woman with black eyes continued to stand at the entrance, motionless, as if waiting for something. Daniel felt a chill run up his spine, but he forced himself to maintain his composure. Who was she? The innkeeper looked away, muttering something inaudible. The few customers lowered their heads, avoiding looking at her. Everyone seemed to fear her. Before Daniel could say anything, the woman simply turned and walked out. The journalist's instinct told him to let her go, but his curiosity, it was stronger than his fear. Daniel left the tavern and followed his steps through the dark streets of the village. The night air was heavy, and the house lights, they flickered as if they were about to go out. The woman walked slowly, as if she knew he would follow her. After a few minutes, he realized where she was taking him. The narrow trail they followed led to the caves of Zugarramurdi, the place where witches were tried, tortured, and condemned to the stake. Daniel's heart quickened. When they finally arrived, the woman he stopped in front of the dark entrance to the cave. Without turning around, she spoke for the first time, her voice sounding like an echo muffled by the wind. "They are still here." Daniel frowned. "Who?" The woman did not respond. Instead, he took a step into the cave and disappeared into the darkness. Daniel hesitated for a moment, but then took out his cell phone and turned on the flashlight. The light revealed damp walls covered in ancient symbols carved into the rock. Symbols he had seen before, in the archives he had studied in Madrid. He advanced slowly, feeling the humidity in the air and the sound of water drops echoing through the cave. The woman was gone, but before he could call her, the air around him turned freezing cold. And then he listened. Whispers. Low, distant, as if ancient voices still echoed in that cursed place. Daniel swiveled the flashlight quickly. There was no one there, just rocks and shadows stretching down the dark tunnel. He tried to rationalize, the wind passing through the cracks in the cave, right? But then the whispers got louder. Now he could distinguish words. Words in a language I didn't know, but somehow understood. The bonfire didn't take us. The blood still needs to be paid. The chosen one has arrived. Daniel felt his body stiffen. Chosen. It was then that a hand grabbed his shoulder. He turned around abruptly, ready to fight. But there was no one there. The final whisper came so close to his ear that he almost felt the ghostly breath. Go away, Daniel. With his heart racing, he ran out of the cave. Upon reaching the entrance, the cold disappeared instantly. The night air felt lighter. But something inside him had changed. It was then that an elderly man from the village appeared, standing on the path. He held a rosary between his trembling fingers, his gaze fixed on Daniel. You heard them, didn't you? The old man's voice was weak, but filled with genuine fear. Daniel didn't respond. I didn't know what to answer. The old man stepped forward, his face grim in the pale moonlight. The 13 souls never rested. And before Daniel could ask anything else, the man turned and disappeared into the darkness. Daniel's head was still throbbing when he returned to the village. The old man's words echoed in his mind. The 13 souls never rested. What did that mean? He had heard legends about witchcraft trials, but something that night it seemed too real. He needed answers. The only place that could contain records about the past was the small village library, an old building with stone walls and dusty windows. Even though it was late at night, Daniel saw a faint light flickering inside. He pushed open the heavy wooden door. A bell rang softly above the entrance, but no one came to greet him. The place was empty. The shelves were old and cramped, full of books forgotten by time. The smell of old paper and mold permeated the air. Daniel walked through the dark corridors, looking at the titles. Most of the books were about the history of the region, but he was looking for something more specific. At the back of the library, he found a half-open door. Inside, a single candle illuminated a table covered in yellowed paper. Someone had been searching there recently. In the center of the table, a book caught our attention. It was small, made of worn leather and closed with a dark fabric cord. Daniel took the book, and when he opened it, he felt a shiver runs down your spine. It was a diary. The name on the first page made his blood run cold. Catalina Aguirre. He already knew that name. Catalina was one of 13 women condemned to burning at the stake in the 1610 trials. The first pages were records of his life before the accusation. Short notes on medicinal herbs, tea recipes, things that in another time would not have been seen as witchcraft. But then, as he turned the pages, the writings changed. The handwriting came more frantic, the words more desperate. They found us, there's nowhere left to run. The bonfire awaits us, but the fire will not be the end. We seal the pact. If one of us falls, we will all come back. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. What did Catalina mean by that? He turned a few more pages until one particular sentence caught his attention. The chosen one will come. He will bear the blood of the Inquisition. He will complete the pending sacrifice. The chosen one. The same word he had heard in the cave, and then on the last page, scribbled as if written in a hurry, he saw something that made his heart race. His name will be Daniel. Daniel felt his vision darken for an instant. The diary was talking about him. But how was that possible? Before he could process the information, a noise echoed through the library. Steps. Daniel turned sharply. In the dark corridor between the bookshelves, a silhouette was standing still. Era, the woman with black eyes. She watched him silently, as if waiting for him to understand something, and then smiled. Daniel held his breath. The woman with black eyes didn't move. She was there, standing in the dark hallway of the library, her face lit only by the flickering flame of the candle on the table. Her smile was subtle, but there was something wrong. "You already know who it is, don't you?" she said, her voice low and drawling, as if she were speaking directly into his mind. Daniel held Catalina Aguirre's diary tightly. His name was written there. The prophecy spoke about a chosen one, about a pending sacrifice. What does this mean? He tried to keep his voice steady, but there was a tone of desperation in his words. The woman tilted her head slightly. "It means you should never have come." Before he could respond, the library lights flickered. The sound of something falling came from another room. A dry rumble, followed by absolute silence. Daniel took a step back, his instincts telling him to get out of there immediately. When he looked back at the woman, she was no longer there. His heart hammered against his chest. She had simply disappeared. Daniel left the library almost running. The streets of Zugarramurdi were even emptier than before. The few houses that still had electricity, they turned off their windows as soon as he passed. The village knew something. He needed to talk to someone, anyone who could explain what was going on. And then he remembered the old man who had warned him about the 13 souls in the cave. He lived near the central square, in a small wooden house with a crooked porch. If there was anyone who knew the truth, it was him. But when Daniel arrived, something was wrong. The door to the house was ajar, creaking slightly in the wind. "Hello?" Daniel called, hesitantly. No response. He pushed the door open slowly. The inside was dark. The smell of wet earth and something rotted hovered in the air. His heart sped up. The house was empty, but not completely. In the center of the room, on the wooden floor, someone had written something in dark ash. Daniel shined his cell phone and felt an icy cold run up his spine. He was the first. It was then that he saw it. Behind the door, a coat was hanging. Era, the same coat the old man wore the night before. The air became heavy. The old man had disappeared, and Daniel knew deep in his chest that he wouldn't be the only one. That's when he felt a look on him. He looked up at the window, and there she was, the woman with black eyes, observing him, silent, smiling. The wind blew through the empty house, making the door creak slightly. "Daniel, I couldn't take my eyes off the black-eyed woman, who was still watching him from the window. She knew. She knew the old man was gone. And maybe she knew where he had gone." Daniel felt the weight of Catalina Aguirre's diary inside his backpack. Everything was connected. The trials, the curse, the disappearances, and somehow, he. The woman didn't move. She just tilted her head slightly, as if she expected him to follow her. He should run away. Every instinct was screaming to get out of there. But the journalist inside him couldn't ignore the chance to uncover the truth. Daniel left the house and took a few hesitant steps towards the woman. But before he could speak, she turned and started walking. Her black dress trailed lightly over the earth and his feet didn't make any noise. He followed her. The village was even quieter than before. No lights in the windows, no sounds of voices. It was as if everyone had disappeared. The only thing Daniel could hear were his own footsteps, and the faint distant sound of something being whispered by the wind. The woman took him to outside the village, following a narrow path that wound through the forest. The trees around seemed to close in on him, as if they were trying to block his passage. With each step, the sound of whispering grew louder. It was then that Daniel saw it. A clearing lit by blue flames. Hidden between the trees, he held his breath. What he saw there made his blood run cold. Nearly 10 villagers were gathered around a fire, their silhouettes distorted by the flames. They wore dark robes and held ancient symbols carved from wood. Your lips moved in chants, but their voices were low, in unison, ritualistic. On the floor, a circle of black ash had been designed. In the center, something was partially buried, something Daniel couldn't see completely. So the woman with black eyes entered the clearing, and the villagers, they stopped singing. Daniel felt his heart hammer in his chest. He was in the middle of something really big. If those people found him there, he knew he wouldn't make it out alive. Trying to back away slowly, he took a step back. The dry branch snapped beneath his foot. The sound echoed through the forest like a gunshot. The villagers' heads turned at the same time, and everyone looked directly at him. For a second, no one moved. The villagers, now motionless around the blue bonfire, they fixed their eyes on Daniel. Their expressions were empty, inhuman, as if there was no longer any consciousness behind those faces. The silence that followed it was worse than any scream. Then everything happened at the same time. The villagers, they launched themselves towards him. Daniel turned and ran, his heart hammering against his chest. The tree branches whipped his face, and the shadows of the forest seemed to move along with him. Heavy footsteps resounded behind him, approaching too quickly. His lungs burned. He ran back to the village, trying to remember his way in the darkness. But Zugarramurdi looked different. The streets were wrong. He turned a corner and came face to face with a stone wall where an alley had been. The houses seemed out of place, as if the village changed shape around you. Daniel reached the inn panting. His hands shook as he unlocked the door and locked himself. In the room, it was safe. For now. He leaned against the door, trying to catch his breath. That's when he felt it. The smell of ash. The room was dark, but something it wasn't right. There was a faint glow on the opposite wall. Daniel narrowed his eyes, and when he turned on the lamplight, he felt his stomach drop. The wall was marked, engraved in dark ash, a symbol he recognized. The same symbol drawn in the cave. The same symbol that the villagers carried in the ritual, and now was inside his room. The symbol, it seemed to pulse as if it were alive. Daniel felt a sudden heat rise up his arm. When he lifted his shirt sleeve, the mark was on his skin, burned in it. A pain unbearable took over his body. Daniel fell to his knees, holding his arm, while a familiar whisper filled the room. The chosen one's blood is marked. The ritual is nearing its end. The pain increased. His entire body throbbed as if he were catching fire. And then, in the bedroom mirror, he saw. Behind him, the black-eyed woman was standing still, and she was smiling. Daniel's reflection trembled. In the mirror, his own face was pale, sweaty, his eyes wide with pure terror. Behind him, the black-eyed woman remained motionless. His smile was subtle, but there was something deeply wrong with her. He turned around quickly, but the room was empty. Panic gripped his chest. Your arm kept burning, the black mark still throbbing on his skin. This wasn't a dream. Something was happening to him. Something I couldn't understand. That's when the bedroom door opened by itself. Daniel held the air, hoping to see someone there. But the inn hallway was desert. Outside, the entire village seemed silent. No sound of wind, no barking of dogs, no human voice. But I wasn't alone. Outside, in the middle of the empty street, the woman with black eyes was waiting for him. Daniel felt a chill run up his spine. She wanted him to follow her, and he went. Your legs moved without him noticing. He crossed the streets of Zugarramurdi, following the woman through narrow alleys and winding alleys, until they reached a small abandoned chapel, its walls covered in moss. The woman entered without hesitation. Daniel stopped at the door. The air inside the chapel was freezing. permeated with the smell of damp earth and burnt wax. "What do you want from me?" His voice sounded low, broken. The woman turned slowly, her black eyes shining in the darkness. "You know the answer." Daniel felt his body shiver. "I don't know anything." She took a step forward. "You know, yes, it's inside you, always has been." He shook his head, stepping back. "This is crazy. I'm just a journalist. You are the final piece of the prophecy." Daniel stopped breathing. The woman raised her hand and touched her chest. Immediately, he saw the bonfire burning, the screams of women being consumed by fire, the smell of charred meat, and in their midst a man wearing the clothes of the Inquisition. He knew that face. It was his. The shock hit him like a blade. He wasn't just investigating the story, he was part of it. The woman whispered, "You are the Inquisitor who condemned us." And then, the world around him fell apart. Daniel fell to his knees on the cold floor of the chapel, his mind a whirlwind of images and voices. The Inquisitor, the bonfire, the screams of women burned alive. It all seemed like a nightmare, but he knew it was real. The black-eyed woman remained motionless before him, watching. Your reaction with an unsettling coldness. "Do you understand now?" His voice echoed through the empty chapel. Daniel looked up at her. His breathing was ragged, his forehead covered in sweat. "This is impossible. I'm not him. That was centuries ago." The woman tilted her head slightly, as if she was waiting for that answer. "Time does not erase what has been done." She took a step forward, and Daniel felt the ground vibrate slightly, as if something beneath them was waking up. The 13 women accepted the fire because they knew that death would not be the Duriwat, the voice of the era dark, full of something very old. They sealed a pact. Daniel felt his blood run cold. "What kind of pact?" The woman smiled. "They promised to return, and for that, they needed you." The floor of the chapel shook again. Daniel looked around, trying to understand. The candles that had previously dimly illuminated the altar began to burn with a cold blue flame. The shadows around they lengthened, moving on their own. The Inquisitor who condemned them. The woman continued, her voice lower now, almost a whisper. "He didn't disappear, he was reborn, Daniel." He shook his head. "No, that can't be true." But he felt the truth within himself. Every fragment of the story, every vision, every whisper, everything was inside him, as if his own body remembered what his mind was still trying to deny. It was then that he realized. The mark on your arm, it was not just a symbol, a seal. The seal that connected him to the past. The seal that linked him to the 13 curse. The black-eyed woman raised her hand and lightly touched the symbol on her arm. The pain returned instantly. Daniel shouted, but this time something was ripped from him. "A piece of your soul," and then he heard, outside the chapel, voices began to sing. The whole village waited for him. The ritual was about to begin. And now, Daniel no longer had a choice. Daniel ran. He left the chapel like a wounded animal, his chest heaving, his mind spinning. The black-eyed woman's words still echoed in his ears. He was the Inquisitor. He hadn't just investigated the story. He was part of it. The streets of Zugarramurdi, they were no longer the same. The houses looked like older, as if they had been consumed by time. The lights were gone. There were no street lights or lit windows, just one suffocating pitch. Daniel ran to the inn where he was staying. It was the only place he knew. I needed a moment to think, to understand what was happening. If there was still any chance of escape, he needed to find it now. He went up the stairs 2 steps at a time, entered the room and locked the door behind him. The heart beat like a drum. Silence. Daniel pressed his hands to his face. What the hell would he do now? Then, something has changed. The air inside the room, it became heavy, dense, charged with electricity. He smelled a familiar scent, ashes. He turned slowly and froze. The windows were covered in burnt symbols, and then the knocking began. 1, 2, 3. From all the windows. From every door, someone, or something was out there. Daniel swallowed hard, gripping the door handle tightly. If he hid his breathing, maybe they would go away. But then he realized, the knocks didn't just come from outside, they came from inside the walls. Daniel backed away, his body shaking. The wood began to crack. Small cracks opened in the ceiling, the walls, the floor. Something was trying to get in. Then he heard her voice. "It's time, Daniel," the black-eyed woman whispered inside his mind. He looked at the mirror, and he almost fell backwards. Your reflection did not accompany him. The fogged glass, he saw someone else, a man in Inquisition clothing holding a scroll with 13 names. His own eyes stared at him. And then, the glass shattered. The knocking stopped. Absolute silence took over the room. And Daniel, I knew it was already too late. The mirror shards spread across the floor like fragments of a past that Daniel didn't want to accept. He didn't move. Your reflection, or the man who was in his place, had disappeared in the broken glass. But something inside Daniel, I already knew the truth. The mark on your arm throbbed violently, as if it were alive. The seal was complete. That's when the candles in the room lit themselves. The flame was bluish, wavering as if something invisible was breathing within the room. And then, he saw her. The woman with black eyes was sitting on the edge of the bed. Daniel, I hadn't heard her come in. Her dark dress seemed made of the night itself. Her eyes did not reflect light. She tilted her head slightly, analyzing him, with a disturbing calm. Now you understand. Daniel. He shook his head, denying it. I didn't want to understand. This is a lie. I'm just a journalist. I didn't do any of that, the woman smiled. It doesn't matter what you believe. You already made your choice the moment you arrived at this village. Daniel backed away, his chest rising and falling rapidly. If there was a way out, he needed to find it now. I can leave. The woman, he gave a low laugh. Tent. Daniel ran to the door and turned the handle. Nothing. At the door didn't move. He kicked hard. The wood did not give way. He turned around, desperate for the woman. What do you want from me? She stood up slowly. Now the entire village seemed to breathe with her. The bedroom walls, they bowed slightly. The floor trembled. The Inquisitor's blood sealed our fate. Now your blood will seal our return. The truth fell on him like a crushing weight. Daniel was the last piece of the ritual. And that night, the prophecy would be fulfilled. The room trembled. The walls seemed to breathe, as if the inn itself was alive. Daniel backed away, his heart hammering, but there was nowhere to run. The woman with black eyes didn't move. He just watched him as if he already knew what would happen. Then, the windows exploded. Glass flew everywhere, and a freezing wind took the room, blowing out the candles and plunging everything into darkness. Daniel tried to run, but the door opened by itself, and outside the whole village was waiting for him. The central square, it was full. Residents of Zugarramurdi gathered around a huge bonfire, their silhouettes swaying in the light of the flames. They didn't speak. They just waited. Daniel. He tried to step back, but invisible hands grabbed him. He was dragged out. The villagers cleared the way as he was forcibly taken to the center of the square. Their faces were expressionless, almost mechanical. The empty eyes, they watched him without blinking. It was then that he saw it. The church, the same church where, centuries ago, the trials took place. Now its doors were wide open, and inside her, something waited for him. Daniel tried to resist, but his body no longer belonged to him. The shadows around bent over him, pulling it in. The interior of the church, it was burned, consumed by time. Black candles lined the hallways, illuminating ancient symbols engraved. On the floor, and no altar, an open book waited for him. The pages were written with blood. Daniel felt a pang in his chest. He recognized that book, the same one that held in the Inquisitor's visions. The black-eyed woman's voice echoed throughout the church. It's time to pay your debt. And then, the 13 shadows appeared. They were no longer just specters. Their bodies burned, they writhed, their dry skin still marked by the fire that consumed them centuries ago. And all they turned to Daniel. The church trembled with the weight of the past. The night of judgment had begun. And he was the condemned one. Daniel tried to run, but there was nowhere to run. The 13 burned women they approached slowly, their bodies still marked by the fire that consumed them centuries ago. His eyes were empty, black holes where nothing remained but hatred and hunger. The church floor trembled, and the black sails went out at once. The only glow came from the flames outside, illuminating the scene, like a macabre theater about to reach its climax. Daniel felt the chains before even seeing them. Something invisible pulled him and threw him against the stone altar. His wrists and ankles were trapped by icy shackles, the metal pressing into his skin like sharp claws. The village was all gathered outside, silent, observing, waiting. The woman with black eyes appeared among the 13 shadows, walking towards the altar. Your eyes, deep as the night, they did not show compassion. The Inquisitor needs to burn, she murmured, and her voice. It wasn't just hers anymore. She carried centuries of pain, centuries of hate. Daniel struggled, but it was useless. With every movement, the chains tightened more. It was then that he realized what was next to you. The corpse of the last chosen one. The yellowed bones were still trapped in the same chains, the skull facing him like a warning. Daniel swallowed. This has happened before. The curse was not a forgotten tale. It was a cycle, the villagers who witnessed. The sacrifice, they were descendants of those who did it before. They were there to pay the debt of the ancestors, but he was the debt. The sacrifice will be completed. The woman with black eyes raised her hand. The 13 shadows, they whispered in unison. The candles turned on again, but now they burned with blue fire. The altar, it started to heat up. Daniel shouted, "But your body." He didn't respond anymore. The fire expected him, and this time, he was the witch. The altar trembled under Daniel, the heat rising rapidly as the blue flames grew around them. He pulled the chains with all my might, but they were trapped as if they were part of the stone itself. The 13 shadows positioned themselves in a circle, their voices whispering in an ancient language, a song that seemed to come from another era. I'm about vibrated inside Daniel's chest, as if reality itself was bending around him. The woman with black eyes approached, raising his hands. The fire intensified. "The Inquisitor will pay your debt." Daniel tried to scream, but his voice broke. He felt something being pulled from within him, as if your soul was being ripped from your body. And then, the screams started. But they weren't his. The villagers, once motionless, they began to squirm. Their faces deformed, their mouths opened, into expressions of pure terror. Something was wrong. The 13 shadows, they turned to the crowd. They didn't just want Daniel. The village entire was marked. One by one, people began to fall to their knees. Blue flames appeared on their bodies, consuming them without haste, as if death was savoring each of them. Daniel watched, horrified. The villagers, they were not there to witness the sacrifice. They were part of him. The village, she hadn't been cursed just to revive the Inquisitor. She had been cursed to feed the witches. The bodies disintegrated into ashes, their souls sucked out by the 13 figures around the altar. The shadows grew, became more solid, more real. And it was then that Daniel understood. They were coming back, and it was just the beginning. Daniel, I couldn't look away. The village of Zugarramurdi was being consumed by the same fire that had condemned witches centuries ago. The villagers screamed, their voices being ripped from their throats as their bodies dissolved into ashes. The 13 burned women grew in power. Their once spectral silhouettes, now they took shape. Skin parched and blackened by fire regenerated slowly. The once empty eyes, they shone with an unholy light. The ritual was working. Daniel pulled the chains, trying to free himself, but the force that tied him to the altar, it wasn't just physics. He felt his energy being drained. Every word of the song, Every flame that consumed the villagers weakened him even more. It was then that he saw her. Isabel. The woman with black eyes I wasn't celebrating. His face, once cold and impassive, now he was marked by doubt. She watched. The witches getting stronger, his eyes carrying a gleam of hesitation. Something bothered her. Daniel latched onto it. It was his only chance. "That's not what you wanted, is it?" His voice was hoarse but firm. "Isabel," she slowly turned to him. "Wake up." But his eyes betrayed him. "Daniel." He noticed the conflict within her. "You thought they would just do justice. But look at this." He indicated the village being consumed, the bodies falling one by one. "They don't want revenge, Isabel. They want a new world." The witch's whispers grew around her. They knew she was hesitating. "You can still choose," Daniel insisted. The pain was unbearable, but he couldn't stop. "If you complete the ritual, they will be unstoppable. Do you really want this?" Isabel trembled. She looked at the key. 13 shadows, now almost completely restored, and then at the dying village beneath her feet. For a moment, time seemed to stop. And then, she made her decision. The chants were interrupted. The witches turned to her, and Isabel raised his hand. It was then that Daniel realized she wasn't just deciding, she would betray them. The blue fire trembled. The 13 witches, they stopped singing at the same time, their burned heads slowly turning towards Isabel. They felt it. Felt betrayal. Before she even acts, Daniel, still tied to the altar, he panted, trying to understand what would happen next. Elizabeth had her hands raised, her fingers shaking, as if he was trying to contain something inside himself. "You're making a mistake." "Isabel." The voice of one of the burned witches cut through the silence. It was deep, cold, as if it came from a bottomless pit. "You called us back. Now you need to keep your promise." But Isabel did not respond. She looked at Daniel, and then he saw it. The fear. She wasn't just betraying her ancestors. She was terrified of what they had become. The village continued to burn, the few remaining villagers crumbling into ashes, their screams swallowed by the night. The curse wasn't just resurrecting the 13. It was erasing everything. And then, Daniel was pulled into the vision. Your body, it locked. The mark on his arm burned like a live coal, and the world around him disappeared. He was in 1610. The flames were real now. He was in the center of the village, surrounded by torch-holding inquisitors and furiously shouting villagers. The 13 women were tied to posts, her eyes fixed on him. In him, the inquisitor. Daniel. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. He wasn't just watching, he was living it. It was then that he heard his own voice. Burn them, he felt everything. The heat of the flames, the smell of burning flesh, the screams that didn't stop. But the worst came later, when the fire consumed the women. They smiled. The curse was cast at the last moment, and the Inquisitor himself was marked to pay the price. The vision, it shattered in a second. Daniel returned to the present with a scream, the body in a cold sweat. Now he understood. He wasn't just a sacrifice. He was the origin of everything. And Isabel, I was the only one who could stop it. The question was, could she? Daniel. I struggled to catch my breath. The vision of the past still burned in his mind as if it were living it all again. I felt the guilt clinging to his chest, suffocating, crushing. He condemned those women. And now, they were back to condemn him, but Isabel, I was hesitant. Her eyes, they were no longer cold and calculating. There was something there now. Doubt. The 13 witches, they didn't hesitate. They were ready to take what was theirs. The ritual was almost complete. The fire was already circling the altar. The chains around Daniel were tightening more every second. But Isabel did nothing. Get it over with. One of the witches stepped forward, her skin still blackened, cracked like live coal. You promised us you would bring us back. The Inquisitor needs to burn. Isabel did not respond immediately. She looked at Daniel, and Daniel knew at that moment. I didn't want that. She wanted revenge, but not like that. She wanted justice, but not an entire village in ashes. No. Her voice was a whisper, but it cut the air like a blade. The witches, they stiffened. What? Isabel took a step back. That's not right. This was never about justice. This is about hunger. The shadows trembled. The fire roared. Isabel! The witch's voice burned with anger. If he doesn't free us, you will join him. Daniel looked at Isabel, the desperation growing in his eyes. If you don't break the ritual, they will take everything. She closed her eyes. The weight of the decision fell on his shoulders. Daniel. I knew she only had two options. She could finish the ritual and free them. But if I did, the world would never be the same again, or could break the cycle. But if I did, perhaps he would die along with him. The altar trembled, the fire rose. Isabel opened her eyes and made your choice. The time seemed to slow down the moment Isabel made her decision. The witches' whispers have ceased, and a heavy silence fell over the ruined village. The blue fire around the altar wavered for a moment, as if the ritual itself hesitated. Daniel, I couldn't take my eyes off her. He saw the conflict, the internal battle playing out on Isabel's face. She was the last descendant of the witches. Their blood ran through their veins. But now, she was about to betray them. Burn it, Isabel. The voice of one of the witches cut through the silence like a cold blade. Pay our debt, but Isabel didn't move. Daniel held his breath. He couldn't speak, but his gaze begged. I didn't want to die there. Then she raised her hand. The witches leaned forward, their blackened silhouettes fluttering like shadows at a campfire. Isabel's eyes glowed blue, and Daniel felt his body shudder. He was channeling the power of the ritual. For an instant he thought she would sacrifice him, but then she turned her hand, and the fire exploded in the wrong direction. The flames roared at the witches themselves. The 13 burned figures, they screamed, not in pain, but in fury. The village trembled as if she were alive, and a gust of black wind came out of the ashes of dead villagers. You betrayed us. The voice of witches overlapped with everything, reverberating through space like thunder. Isabel fought against their power, his fingers clenched, his body shaking under the pressure. The floor. It began to crack beneath his feet. Daniel felt the chains around his wrists weaken. With a final effort, he broke free. The altar shattered. The shadows around, they shouted, trying to hold on to the real world. But Isabel didn't stop. Your body trembled with exhaustion, but she continued reversing the spell. Now, Daniel, Isabel shouted. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I needed to act. He took Catalina Aguirre's book from the altar, the pages burning in your hands, and then without hesitation, he cast him into the blue bonfire. The world collapsed. The village, it shook violently. The shadows screamed in unison, and the 13 witches began to fall apart. The fire, once blue and hypnotic, became golden. The villagers' ashes began to be carried away by the wind, as if they had never existed. Daniel fell to his knees, and when he looked up, the village was disappearing. Zugarramurdi was dissolving into the night. The village was dying. The stone streets crumbled into dust. The houses collapsed as if they were made of paper. The blue flames that once consumed the villagers faded into the air, sucked in by an invisible force. Zugarramurdi was ceasing to exist. Daniel tried to get up, but his body was weak. The spell was draining everything around it, and he felt as if a part of himself was being ripped away along with the village. Isabel was still standing, but he could barely hold himself together. The power she used to break the ritual, it had a price. His face was pale, and his eyes, once full of determination, now they carried the weight of an inevitable sacrifice. It's working, Daniel muttered, feeling the ground vibrate beneath him. Isabel looked at the witches. They didn't scream anymore. Their spectral forms, they writhed, trying to hold on to reality, but the world rejected them. The spell that kept them there was being undone. One of the witches tried to advance against Isabel. His still-burned body trembled like a formless shadow. "You condemn us to oblivion." Isabel closed her eyes. A lone tear ran down her face. "I know." She raised her hands one last time. The fire intensified. The 13 witches began to crumble into dust. Your screams echoed through the night, no longer as vengeful whispers but as regrets of something that was finally coming to an end. Daniel noted as the spirits dissolved into the wind, carried away by the very spell that brought them back, the curse it was breaking. But something was wrong. "Isabel," he staggered back, his body shaking. She looked at Daniel and her lips moved, but no words came out. It was then that he realized she was also disappearing. The same blue glow pulsed on your skin, the extremities of your body becoming ashes. Daniel tried to reach her, but she took a step back. "No," he whispered, realization hitting him like a blade. I couldn't stay. Isabel belonged to the past, and now I was leaving with him. Daniel ran to Isabel, but his hand shot through the air as if he were trying to grab smoke. It was no longer completely there. Her body trembled like witches' shadows before they disappeared, slowly fragmenting. "No, it can't be like that," Daniel shouted, feeling his throat tighten. "She did it to save everyone, to save him." Isabel smiled lightly. "It was the only way." The village around them continued to dissolve. The houses disappeared as if they had never existed. The stone streets collapsed into the void. Zugarramurdi wasn't just crumbling. It was being erased from history. Daniel, he felt the ground beneath. His feet crack. The wind roared around him, carrying with it the ashes of the witches, the villagers, and now of Isabel. "It doesn't have to be like this." He tried to hold her again, but his fingers passed straight through her face, Isabel's eyes. They glowed a deep shade of blue. She didn't seem scared. "Nothing really goes away, Daniel." Her words echoed like a whisper in the air. And then, "She is gone." Daniel felt his chest tighten. He wanted to fight it. He wanted gritarla de volta. But I knew it was impossible. The ritual had been broken, and Isabel was going along with him. Silence fell over him. The village, it was empty now. The bonfires went out. As ruins of Zugarramurdi, they no longer existed. Daniel, he fell to his knees, feeling the weight of it all. The village, it had been built on a curse, and now that the curse had been broken, she had never existed in the first place. Your body, it became heavy. Sleep pulled him, his vision getting dark. The last thing he saw was Isabel's dust being carried by the wind. And then, the world went dark. The silence was absolute. Daniel. He opened his eyes suddenly, panting. The smell of wet earth filled his nostrils. Over it, the gray sky slowly rotated, as if time was adjusting to his return. He was lying on the cold asphalt of a deserted road. Sat down slowly, trying to understand where he was. The last thing he remembered was the village crumbling around him, Isabel disappearing before his eyes. But now, there was no more village. He looked around, nothing but road and forest, no sign of Zugarramurdi, as if it had never existed. His fingers trembled as he touched his own skin. The symbol burned on his arm was gone, no marks, no evidence that it was real. The head throbbed. I needed to get out of there. He got up staggering and started walking, trying to find any trace of civilization. His cell phone was in his pocket, but no signal. The clock ticked 03:33 in the morning. Then headlights appeared. On the road, a car approached slowly. Daniel. He felt his heart race. He ran into the middle of the road, waving frantically. The vehicle stopped a few meters away from him. The passenger door opened, and a man came down. He used a heavy coat and a hat, his expression filled with concern. "Sir, are you okay?" The voice sounded distant, as if coming through a fog. Daniel blinked. Was it? Where? Where am I? The man frowned. "On the road to Zugarramurdi. You are far from the nearest city. What happened?" Daniel was unable to respond. Zugarramurdi, like this? The village had disappeared. I was there. The man looked at him with a strange look. Where? Daniel felt his blood run cold. Zugarramurdi. The man turned pale. Sir, this village hasn't existed for more than 400 years. Silence fell over the road. Daniel felt a chill run up his spine. That wasn't possible. He was there, saw the people, he spoke to Isabel. His fingers tightened around his own arm, but the mark was no longer there. He turned to the car, trying to remain calm. The rear view mirror reflected his face, dirty, tired. But something was wrong. Your eyes. They were not the same. They were completely black, like Isabel's. Daniel's heart stopped for a second, and in the back of your mind, he heard a whisper. Nothing really. Disappears, the curse, it wasn't over. She just found a new body.